Hi everyone, this is Dr. Young, Intro to Africa at Flagler College. This lecture will look at Eastern and Southern Africa in the same period that we have already examined both Ethiopia and West Africa, kind of in this medieval period between, say, 1000 and about 1800 or so. And a lot of this will be similar to the information that we have gotten out of West Africa. There's some commonalities that run through all of sub-Saharan Africa. But that said, each of these cases is unique. And unfortunately, in an introduction class, we can really only kind of hit the high points, as it were, hit some essential points and move on without being able to dig into the nuance of some of these really interesting societies. And so I would encourage you, if you're, if any of this strikes your fancy, there are books and articles and resources out there online, in libraries, other things. Do some of your own work here to extend your knowledge beyond what we do. All right. I realize that in saying that, many of you are probably thinking, well, I only recently started learning about African history. Maybe I'm not ready to dig really deep into some of this, but who knows? Okay. So for Eastern and Southern Africa, much like the other areas we've talked about, though, even more so, I think, because, of course, these lands, and we're really talking about the land stretching from the upper bound of the Central African rainforest down through the rainforest itself, and then, of course, on the eastern side, through the savanna regions, the Serengeti Plain, the Great Rift Valley, the Great Lakes region, down to the Kalahari Desert and all of the surrounding territory there, and even down into the Cape region of what is now South Africa. All of these lands were settled by pioneering agriculturalists. Of course, when they got to far southern Africa, they ran into the Khoisan peoples who were living there. And there were some tensions between them, some clashes. For the most part, the Bantus drove the San into the Kalahari, where they have remained until fairly recent times, though some of the San ended up interbreeding with the Bantu and took up pastoralism and came to form a people in the Cape there. Okay, so pioneering agriculturalists for many centuries. It's thought that they probably reached the southern tip of Africa, the Bantu that is, by about 1,000 years CE. So about 1,000 years ago or so. And there are some debates about that, but it definitely was, quite a long time ago when they finally spread all through Africa. And that didn't mean that they didn't continue to move. They did. The standard trend of working the land until its resources, its nutrients were completely exhausted, and then moving a short distance to a place that had virgin land was still the trend here. But gradually over time, at least in some parts of Eastern and Southern Africa, there were microstates that developed, and in some cases even larger kingdoms. And we'll talk about those larger kingdoms. We'll talk about a few examples, some of which are earlier than others. In general, the Great Lakes region sees the establishment of powerful kingdoms probably by about the 17th century or so, maybe the 16th. And some lands kind of tucked into the rainforest, though still savanna, saw empires or kingdoms developing around the same time. But there are fairly large settlements that could be called microstates even before that, as early as the late first millennium CE. And so, right, so pioneering agriculturalists gradually giving way to microstates. And for most of African history, this divide between the coast, which was dominated by the Arab merchants who created these important settlements on the coast like Mogadishu, Mombasa, Kilwa, and Sofala, as well as Zanzibar, the island of Zanzibar. And the Zanj, the Arabic word for the black Africans who lived in the interior, the Zanj who inhabited the interior. There was a trade relationship between the coast and the interior. They were dependent on each other, but they did not mix socially as much as they might have. There were sort of cultural taboos and things, I think, that kept them from mixing at a higher level. Now that's going to change in more recent times into the 18th and 19th century. The Arabs are going to become more interested in establishing a permanent presence inland, but until then they remained mostly on the coast, and the Zanj remained mostly in the interior. Agriculture spread with the migration of the Bantu, and they were able to master different kinds of agriculture depending on the environment they lived in. In the rainforest, much as with West Africa, they depended on vine crops, especially the African yam. Into the savanna regions, they developed, or they cultivated grain crops, especially the crop called sorghum, which really is the grain crop at least before the Columbian Exchange, before the introduction of New World America, the Americas crops into Africa, was the most important of the grain crops all over sub-Saharan Africa. There were some regions that came to depend on bananas, though, as a staple crop. The picture you see on this slide is of a banana grove in, I believe, Rwanda. The Great Lakes region was good for growing bananas, and for I think most people in the modern day, especially in the West, bananas are kind of a treat. They're the easy to break into fruit that has the perfect packaging system, natural packaging system, and all of that. Something you cut up to put in a fruit salad or put ice cream on or something like that. But bananas contain a lot of nutrients and a lot of calories, and thus you can actually build an entire diet around bananas. And this is what people did in parts of Africa, especially in the Great Lakes region. A well-tended banana grove would last for decades and could provide most of the calories necessary for, say, an entire family, right, for that decades-long period. Now, starting in the 16th century, as contact between the Old World and the New World grew, more and more New World crops were introduced into the Old World. It's one of the adages about the Columbian Exchange, as it's called, the exchange that began with Christopher Columbus, that the Old World got all kinds of agricultural goods, maize or corn, beans, chilies, I got potatoes, and so forth and so on, as well as things like tobacco, and coffee, and anyway. And the Americas got smallpox, right? The Europe and the rest of the Old World did not introduce into the New World many things that were really helpful for people, and that's, I guess, a very subjective point, but it is a truth that probably 80 to 90% of the population of the Americas was wiped out by the Old World diseases that were introduced, like smallpox. Now, that agricultural exchange did not benefit only Europe. It also came to benefit, and in terms of, kind of the sheer human benefit, I would say the benefits for Africa were probably greater than anywhere else. There were crops introduced that were easy to grow in the African environment, that provided large numbers of calories, that were pretty hardy. Cassava, for instance, has become one of the key crops all over sub-Saharan Africa, even though cassava, truthfully, does not have much nutritional component to it. It is sort of empty calories, but it provides some fuel for people. It's also, by all accounts, I've never actually tried cassava, except maybe as an ingredient in some things, I'm not sure, but by most accounts, cassava is pretty nasty, pretty tasteless, and kind of slimy. In any case, these New World crops really revolutionized agriculture in Africa. With the introduction of maize, most of the sorghum-based diets transformed into corn-based diets. Many of them, at least. I shouldn't say most. There are parts of Africa where rice is grown. There are other parts where sorghum remains important. But corn has become really the key ingredient in most of the staple foods in many parts of Africa. The other component of agriculture that's absolutely vital for both Eastern and Southern Africa, at least when you get out of the rainforest into the savannas, and all the way down through kind of the arid regions in the south, is cattle. There were pastoralists who competed with the agriculturalists for territory. There were certainly some people who both farmed and herded. But increasingly in many of these societies, cattle came to form the most important possession that people could have. Wealth was determined in many African societies by the number of cows that a person had. And this has dramatic consequences for the way these societies are organized. Cattle-raising societies tend to be patriarchal and male-dominated, much more so than agricultural societies are, because in agricultural societies, that's not to say they can't be patriarchal, many of them are, but in agricultural societies, women are the ones who do much of the farming, and in some cases, most of the farming. There is often an exchange there where the women do the farming and thus they receive some amount of political power. And so it's really only in agricultural societies where such things are possible. There is almost infinite variation in Africa in the kinds of gender relations that exist in societies, the balance of power between men and women, but certainly women tend to hold a larger share of power in agricultural societies. In cattle-based societies, the worth of a man and of a woman, though in different ways, is determined by a number of cattle. The worth of a man, a male person that is, I will try to use gender-neutral language as much as I can, just talking about human beings, right? But so the worth of a man is determined by the number of cattle that he possesses. Possession is almost invariably in pastoral societies in the hands of men. Women, though, are also reckoned in terms of cattle because in these societies they are traded for cattle in the sense of there are negotiations conducted over marriage partners and an exchange of cattle takes place. Women are the potential groom's family comes to the family of the potential bride, and they negotiate, and they eventually reach the point where the groom's family says, "I will give you X number of cattle in exchange for this, for taking her on, or rather for your daughter, right? You will get the cattle." So there's an exchange of wealth there. It's really difficult to convey, I think, how important cattle are. When I lived in Southern Africa, I did witness this firsthand. I lived for a few months in the country of Botswana, and I lived in the capital city, Gaborone, but I met a lot of people there because I worked in the community. I met a lot of people there who I would sort of get in a conversation with them and ask them, say, about their weekend plans. And they would say, "Oh, I've got to go out and check on my cattle. I have to go out to my cattle post." In other words, they lived in the city. Some of them worked white-collar jobs in office buildings, but they also possessed cattle. And, even in talking to some of these people, they would talk about how they were in the midst of a lobola. That's the Tswana word for this bride price in cattle. We're trying to work out the lobola value of my daughter or the woman my son wants to marry. And so this was about 20 years ago. This was in the middle of the 90s. And even at that point, modern age, right? Cattle was still important. In pre-modern Africa, it was of absolute paramount importance. Some other kind of dichotomies here. A dichotomy between the Great Lakes region and the river valleys, right? These were the main. This isn't a dichotomy so much as a description of where the largest numbers of people tended to live, because these are the best irrigated regions, the ones that are most habitable. The Great Lakes region, as I've said before, is the most densely populated part of Africa. Same goes for the, at least, the more navigable and habitable parts of the Congo River Basin and the Zambezi River Basin. And then, the along the shores of the Limpopo and the Orange River and the Fall River and others in southern Africa, it's the same thing. I mean, this is where people, of course, settled to do agriculture because they needed water. There is this divide between the what is known as the Highveld, the plateau. Most of southern Africa sort of sits on this high plateau, and the Lowveld, the coastal lands. And some peoples, form their identity based on the, living on the arid Highveld plateau. They tend to be pastoralists, whereas in the Lowveld regions, agriculture is more possible. This is really germane for discussion about southern Africa. Environment and disease is important, though it varies, of course. In the rainforest, people have to deal with the tsetse fly. But in a pastoral society, the threat of disease, of course, is always present for human beings, but it may be even more acute and more of a problem when the cattle are the ones who get the disease. Massive outbreaks of rinderpest and other cattle-borne diseases that have killed off massive herds have had tremendous historical impacts. This may be disease to cattle may be the death blow, may have been the death blow of some of these societies that we'll talk about, like Great Zimbabwe, for instance. Variations in environment, of course. Now, one other social theme that we should talk about is inheritance. It's related to this concept of lobola, or bride price. But so there are two main, and there's some variation within each category, but two main ways of reckoning with inheritance and possession of property. Now, that property doesn't mean land necessarily, though it might in some of these microstates, but of cattle and other things, tools and such. In pastoral societies, sorry for the yawn, in many agricultural societies, this runs, as one might expect, from father to son. This is called the patrilineal lineage system, right? So father to son, often the oldest son, though maybe some provision. The oldest son will inherit more, perhaps, but some provision is still made for other sons. And women in these societies will have a value that must exchange when marriage is taking place. That value of the woman must be exchanged from one family to the other, right? Now, in a matrilineal society, on the other hand, and this is very strange, you might think that property would sort of pass from mother to daughter in this case. And in a way, that's almost how it happens. The woman is the one to whom the property is tied. Okay? And this is only in agricultural societies in sub-Saharan Africa, and not, of course, not all agricultural societies are matrilineal. In a way, it passes through the female line, but the male members of the female line are still the ones who do most of the controlling of the property. Right? Women in matrilineal societies tend to have more of a hold on power, more of a say in the way that things happen, the decisions that are made and such. But the men in the matriarchal side are the ones who do most of the administration of the property, take care of things, as it were. And so, I mean, just to demonstrate a little bit, when I'm in the classroom, I, tend to pull people up and say, okay, so you are the one who inherits the land, right? And you have children, and pull somebody else up and say, okay, you two are married, and then this is your brother, right? And okay, so who takes care of the kids and all of that? And I think it's helpful to demonstrate in that way, although this is probably just confusing for those of you listening on here. Put simply, a woman gets married in a matrilineal society to her husband, has children, and the husband is not the one responsible for seeing to the inheritance of his own children. Okay, that's not his responsibility, because the property doesn't pass through his hands. It doesn't become his when he marries his wife. It's still hers, or it belongs to her family. So who then sees that, does things like arrange the marriages of the children in the family and make sure that each one of them receives a piece of the inheritance? Well, it tends to be not the mother or the women in the family, but rather her male relatives, especially her brothers, would be taking care of their nieces and nephews when it comes to inheritance. They'd be arranging their nieces' marriages. They would be seeing to the passing on of the inheritance to the children, both male and female. They would really, the arrangement of the marriage is more important probably for the sons, because matrilineal societies are also what we call uxora local. Uxor is the Latin word for wife, by the way, and so local to the wife. And that means that, essentially, the most important part of a system that is uxora local is that when a couple gets married, the man, the groom, leaves his family property, his family estate, as it were, and moves to his wife's property. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean he sort of sits around and drinks and plays video games or something like that, right? He has to go back to his mother's property and take care of it, because he needs to see to the inheritance of his nieces and nephews. Okay? And so the property passes in the female line, though the men on the matriarchal side are the ones who tend to do the administering of inheritance. Patrilineal societies are patriarchal and patrilocal as well. The bride goes to live with her husband's family when she gets married. All right, so hopefully that was clear. If any of this is unclear, please ask questions on the discussion boards. Much as with West Africa, though, with some variation, religion, the most important, at least one of the very most important, probably the kind of day-to-day most common rituals and things deal with the veneration of the ancestors. The ancestors are the ones who are thought to be most proximate in existence to the living to the living beings, the living humans. And so they're the ones who need to be appeased, approached, who grant dispensation and gifts and favors to their descendants, right, from the supernatural world, as it were. And so a lot of customs about ancestors. Funerary practices are very important. Much as, in most of sub-Saharan Africa, this tends to be common among Niger-Congo speaking peoples. There are also, and we see some of this to some extent in West Africa, but I think it's even more so in Southern Africa, spirit mediums, people who are able to divine the will of supernatural beings, whether the dearly departed ancestors or some other kind of being. There's a whole kind of pantheon of gods and of sort of demonic creatures, which are not always evil necessarily. Sometimes they're just mischievous. There's a character in Southern African mythology, for instance, called the Tokoloshe, who is really just a troublemaker, right? So this would be the one that if you lose your car keys or your cell phone or your glasses or something like that, you'd blame that on the Tokoloshe. The Tokoloshe must have been the one that came and stole this from me. The Tokoloshe is something that appears in sculpture in Southern Africa too, so it's an interesting little creature. But people are able to divine the will of these spirits, whether good or evil or just kind of neutral and mischievous. And that's an important part of the belief system. This is the way that people divine, the future. There are prophetic elements to it, and also interpret the past to some extent. There's no perfect equivalent of a griot in Southern Africa, though. The ones who are spirit mediums and traditional healers often also are lore masters who tell the stories of the ancestors. All right, politically, Eastern and Southern Africa, let's look at a few examples here. Two really interesting kingdoms, and by the way, more about this, I was doing a little study before as I was preparing this lecture today, and I came across a website that has, from the Met in New York, that has some really wonderful information about these two kingdoms of the Savannah region, bordering right on the rainforest, and in fact, even lording over some of the rainforest. Luba and Lunda, some of their artwork, for instance, this is, I think, really interesting stuff, and then some information about them as well. So, this is one of those areas where I might encourage you to look into this a little deeper. But the political system in Luba and Lunda is really kind of fascinating. The leader of, and this starts in Luba to the east there, but, okay, so just geographically, right, the Congo River runs from up here down to the coast, and here's the Kingdom of Congo, which we talked about last time. But if you get further south, these tributaries that feed into the Congo, you actually get down here into Savannah region. This is where Luba and Lunda were. Not quite to the Great Lakes, but more right in the center of the continent there. Starts in Luba, and then Lunda borrowed this from Luba and came up with a system that was very similar. So Luba had a king who was thought to be semi-divine or holy. At least when the king died, he was thought to become a deity. And the existing king, the living king, was tied, even in terms of like being a medium for the spirit of the old kings, the deceased kings. When the king of Luba died, not only did he become a deity, but his home village would then erect a shrine that would become one of the more important religious centers. So they worshipped their former kings and really felt that the kingship was perpetual. It's almost, and I want to say it's not quite this, but it's similar in some ways to the Dalai Lama in Tibet, where the idea is that there is this God who takes human form, and so when the Dalai Lama dies, they search through the countryside and find someone who was born right at the moment of the Dalai Lama's death, and identify that new person as the Dalai Lama. It's not quite like that. There is a sense of reincarnation, by the way, in the Luba Lunda system, but it's not quite like that. But this king is linked somehow as a medium of these old kings, and there are even incarnations, female incarnations in both Luba and Lunda of the old king, or not exactly of the old king, but of a portion of the spirit of the old king, and so these become the spirit mediums, the ones who preside over the worship of the old king and speak his will and such, right? So really rich kind of religious/political system here. Now, the king was the overall ruler, but the day-to-day power was conducted by people who held uh, positions, kind of noble positions, governmental power positions in the society. Um, and these passed from father to son in important families. And so there was an element of nobility to this as well. And even the regions, the different collections of villages, almost like the West African Kafus, that collectively made up the Kingdom of Luba had these, positional succession leaders, almost kind of mini kings who ruled over them, all in the service of the overall King of Luba. Okay, again, I wish I could do more justice to this, but we can't kind of describe everything in absolutely full detail. We'd never make it through this class. Another area that should interest us is the Great Lakes region. Up here again in this Nilotic Bantu contact zone, right? This area where agricultural knowledge passed from the Nilotic peoples, the Nilo-Saharan speakers, into the hands of the Bantu. This area stretching from Ethiopia down here into the Great Lakes has been home to some of the richest and most important societies in African history. The people who inhabited this region kind of north and west of Lake Victoria here were called the Bito. And much of the history starting in about the 16th century through the 19th century of this area has to do with the aggression of the groups of Bito peoples. This is a kind of sub-branch of the Bantu, I think. And this map doesn't show all of them, right? The first kingdom that's developed is just to the west of Buganda here. It's called Bunyoro. And it stretched over a fairly large territory. You've got like Lake Albert and Lake Kivu up here. Actually, no, this is Lake Kivu. This is North Kivu. This is South Kivu. Anyway, but through this region, and Buganda was in some ways a split off of that. Bunyoro, I think some people from some of the Yoro people came over here and formed the Kingdom of Buganda, and these two ended up being massive rivals through much of this period. Buganda ultimately would be the strongest of all of these kingdoms, not just because it had effective warriors, but was also more proximate to the coastlands here, and so it was able to trade with the coast and came to great wealth as a result of that. The Kingdom of Buganda also had a really effective navy made up of warriors on canoes, such that they dominated all around Lake Victoria, right? So they were able to take their canoes, these are their war canoes, and attack surrounding villages, extracting tribute from them and slaves in some cases, which they then traded to the merchants on the coast. And so Buganda was it was an aggressor. We also have the Kingdom of Rwanda and the Kingdom of Burundi, roughly in the lands that those modern nations occupy, and they're all competing for control of this territory. Now, already at this point, we also have some tension in this area between pastoralists and agriculturalists. The pastoralists were the ones who tended to exert the greatest amount of authority, because back to the Chaldean model, let's remember that pastoralists, herders, nomads, tend to be more warlike, and so they exerted hegemony over the agriculturalists. This is the very beginning of a tension that will grow over time, right? So the king of Rwanda, the king of Burundi, were pastoralists. They were herders, and ruled over a population that was predominantly agriculturalist. And there was a kind of minority group, maybe 10 to 15% of the population or so, who tended to have greater authority because they were also pastoralists. Now that said, there was a great amount of fluidity. These lines did not harden at this point, but these are the very early origins of the ethnic groups called Tutsi and Hutu. The Tutsi is the herders and the Hutu is the farmers. And over time, those identities changed, and we'll pick that up again later on in the course. Another example of a microstate, not really, I mean, I guess it's kind of a kingdom, but a very interesting one is Great Zimbabwe. And truthfully, Great Zimbabwe predates Lubalunda and all of these kingdoms of the Great Lakes region, stretching back to probably around the turn of the first millennium, maybe the late 10th, early 11th century. Great Zimbabwe, and then there are also, microstates closer to, well, down here in southern Africa. We don't have yet the Zulu, but the Xhosa peoples were starting to form small microstates, same with the Sotho. So kind of all over southern Africa, we've got microstates. Let's talk about Great Zimbabwe a little bit. This is one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. And it seems to have been inhabited for about 500 years, from say 1,000 to around 1,500. That doesn't mean the whole thing was built in 1,000 and inhabited for that 500 years. Some parts of it were built, starting fairly early. Some parts of it were built fairly late. In general, there are three main portions of Great Zimbabwe. The whole site covers about 1,800 acres. Or about, 5 square miles or so, okay? But the whole thing is, covered with these walled compounds. 3 of these compounds, one on a hill called the Hill Complex, this one actually called the Great Enclosure, and then one that's in a valley, which is called the Valley Complex. Were larger and more important than others, and thought to be closely associated with the ruler of Great Zimbabwe, and possibly with the religious leaders. The Great Enclosure, it seems, and this is a theory, it's not universally accepted, but we'll go with it anyway. The Great Enclosure was possibly the residence of the ruler of Great Zimbabwe. The Hill Complex was a religious center. The Valley Complex was rather late and may have been a later residence of the kings, or may have been the kind of later built and later inhabited portion of this remarkable site. Here is an aerial shot of this. So this is the Great Enclosure, right? Here is the Hill Complex, I believe, and then the Valley Complex is down here, I think. I'm pretty sure. Anyway. You can see that this is all, covered with these walls. In general, the walls are about 5 meters high. In the Great Enclosure, back to this slide, they reach about 11 meters high, so 35 feet or so. And all of these walls are built without mortar. There's not a bit of mortar. These are stones that are cut very precisely and laid together, in some cases even in decorative patterns. The chevron pattern tends to run all through Great Zimbabwe, so really interesting aesthetic component to this. There are even walled paths that run. The Great Enclosure has an outer wall and an inner wall, for instance, possibly because the inner wall started to deteriorate, so they built the outer wall later. It's uncertain. In any case, really incredible place. This was largely a pastoral kingdom, meaning that this is in a fairly arid region. Some people may have done some farming, but many of these walls were used to corral cattle, and especially the cattle of the ruler of Great Zimbabwe, who was tremendously powerful and thus tremendously wealthy, which means, again, for Southern Africa, he has lots of cows, right? There are other things that have been found in Great Zimbabwe that are important. There are these bird sculptures made out of soapstone. Again, this is something you ought to look up and learn a little about. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I have not been there, unfortunately. This is one of those places I really want to go at some point in my life. Yeah, Great Zimbabwe has these sculptures, these 5 birds, really delicately carved birds that have been found there that were probably religious symbols. None of them, unfortunately, were found in situ because the Portuguese already in the 16th century learned about this place. And from certainly the early 19th century on, there were European travelers who went into Great Zimbabwe and began to just like take the artifacts they found or dug up there. And so all of these birds were studied, they were turned up in Europe. None of them were studied in situ, as it's called, on the site itself. But other things have been found that shed some light on the economic activities of Great Zimbabwe. Glass beads that were made in China, as well as Chinese porcelain and other goods from the eastern end of the Indian Ocean trading archipelago have been found in Great Zimbabwe. What we seem to see here is a fairly stable, wealthy microstate with lots of cattle and probably also access to gold deposits, who traded with the Arabs on the coast, probably trading gold, possibly slaves, maybe some other products like ivory or rhino horn or something like that to the Arab merchants on the coast, and receiving in return goods that came from other parts of the Indian Ocean. In any case, Great Zimbabwe was linked into the world economy in a remarkably globalized way. And this as early as the 11th century, right? This was, again, inhabited for about 500 years until about 1500, when it seems to have been abandoned and eventually fell into ruin. But tremendously interesting site with lots of cool features. Okay, so that does it for our discussion of this period, kind of, native African developments. We will turn our attention next to the transatlantic slave trade, and really to the transition from what we might call the pre-modern era of African history to the more modern period of African history, and that is marked, for better or for worse, by the beginnings of European contact with Africa and European manipulation of parts of Africa. So that's what we have to look forward to next. Thanks.